Hello everyone. Welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we dive into tonight's chilling tale, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment if you enjoy bedtime stories filled with mystery and suspense. Your support keeps these stories alive, and it helps me bring you even more strange encounters from around the world. Now, let's begin. It was late in the evening, just after 11:45 p.m. on a cold November night in 2018, when Daniel Harris, a 32-year-old photographer from Manchester, arrived in Detroit, Michigan. He had flown across the Atlantic with his best friend Mark Collins, a history graduate who had an obsession with abandoned architecture. Together, they had planned a series of night explorations, documenting forgotten places that once carried the heartbeat of industry. That night, their destination was the Riverton Steel Plant, a massive factory complex shut down since the early 1990s, standing silently in the east side of Detroit. Locals often referred to it simply as the Ghost Factory, a place avoided even by the city's homeless. Rumors spoke of strange noises, shadows moving in broken windows, and, most unsettling of all, voices that seemed to echo long after the factory had fallen silent. Daniel parked their rental car under a flickering street lamp, the cold wind rattling through shattered glass and rusted fences. Mark checked his watch, then whispered, almost nervously, "Midnight is the best time, mate. If there's anything left in there, we'll hear it." They slipped inside through a side gate where the metal had been bent open years ago, their footsteps crunching over shards of glass. The air was heavy with the smell of damp concrete, rust, and something faintly chemical that lingered from the old machines. Their flashlights cut across walls covered in graffiti, some of it fresh, but most of it fading under layers of dust. As they reached the main assembly hall, the scale of the place overwhelmed them. Towering steel beams stretched into the darkness, and the roof, though partially collapsed, still gave the impression of a cathedral built for industry. Daniel lifted his camera, the shutter sound echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. But then, there was another sound, a faint murmur, almost like a whisper, drifting across the vast, empty floor. Both men froze. Mark frowned. "Did you hear that?" Daniel nodded, his heartbeat quickening. It had been too clear to be the wind. They turned off their flashlights, standing in complete darkness, only the sound of dripping water filling the silence. Then, again, it came. A voice, low, drawn out, as if calling from a distance. Neither of them could make out the words, but it carried the distinct tone of human speech. Mark whispered, "There's no one here, there can't be." They followed the sound cautiously, stepping deeper into the plant. Their breaths formed white clouds in the freezing air. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. The voices didn't just come from one direction. Sometimes they seemed to float from the far end of the hall, other times from the catwalks above, and occasionally, terrifyingly, right behind them. Daniel's hand shook slightly as he recorded a short video. "It's like the walls are talking," he muttered. They reached what used to be the workers' locker room. The smell was worse here, mold, damp fabric, and the faint metallic tang of rust. Rows of lockers stood open like gaping mouths. Mark touched one, and it creaked on its hinges. That was when the whispering grew louder. Not one voice now, but many, layers of speech overlapping, too fast and too chaotic to understand. It filled the room, bouncing off the concrete walls. Daniel's chest tightened. He had read about residual hauntings, imprints of sound and energy left behind after years of tragedy or repetition. but experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. Mark turned pale. Daniel! They sound like they're working, like a whole shift still here. And indeed, when Daniel listened closely, the voices carried rhythm, snippets of laughter, fragments of shouted orders, even the faint echo of machinery long gone. For a moment, it felt as though the factory had awakened, not in flesh and blood, but in sound. Then, cutting through all of it, came a single distinct word: leave. It was sharp, commanding, and closer than anything else they'd heard. Both men spun around, flashlights snapping back on, but the beam only revealed empty lockers and peeling paint. Their courage wavered. Mark took a step back. Mate, I don't like this. We've got what we need. Let's go. But Daniel, driven by both fear and fascination, raised his camera again. The lens caught something in the corner of the room. At first, it looked like a shadow cast by the flashlight, but it moved independently. It shifted, stretched, and for a fraction of a second, it took the vague outline of a man standing with his head lowered, as though exhausted after a long shift, and then vanished. Daniel gasped, nearly dropping his camera. Mark grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the exit, but before they could reach the door, the voices swelled again, louder, angry now, as though a crowd was shouting at them all at once. The sound pressed against their skulls, disorienting, filling every corner of the space. And that was when they both realized the voices weren't just echoes. They were answering. Daniel could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. The voices weren't just drifting through the walls anymore. They were coming closer, circling them, pressing in with invisible weight. Mark's grip on his arm tightened, as though afraid that if he let go, Daniel would be swallowed by the sound. "Daniel, we shouldn't be here," Mark whispered, his voice almost drowned out by the phantom noise. But Daniel couldn't move. His flashlight shook in his hand, sweeping across the ruined room, catching the glint of broken glass, the stains of rust, the peeling paint that hung like skin from the walls. Every detail seemed sharper now, as though the factory itself had awakened and was breathing around them. The voices continued, layering on top of one another, shifting from whispers to shouts, from laughter to groans. It was like standing in the middle of 1,000 conversations, all spoken by people who no longer existed. Then again, that single word cut through the chaos. Leave. This time it was louder, echoing with authority. The sound didn't just enter their ears. It reverberated inside their skulls, forcing both men to flinch. Mark dragged Daniel toward the corridor. Their boots scraped across the concrete floor, crunching through debris. The farther they went, the more distorted the sound became, like an old radio tuning in and out, mixing voices from different decades. Some of the words were foreign to Daniel, old American slang from the mid-20th century, but others were disturbingly clear. "Don't stop working. Clock out in 30. Where's the foreman? My God, it hurts." The last phrase froze Daniel in his tracks. It hadn't sounded like a worker's routine chatter. It had been desperate, filled with pain. He turned back, raising his camera instinctively. The red light on the device blinked as it recorded the dark hallway behind them. There, just beyond the reach of the flashlight, a figure lingered. At first it seemed human, tall, broad-shouldered, standing perfectly still in the shadows. But as Daniel focused, he noticed the head wasn't quite right. It seemed tilted unnaturally far back, as though broken. He whispered, his voice trembling. "Mark, do you see that?" Mark followed his gaze, and the instant his light fell upon the figure, it vanished. The corridor was empty once more. Mark cursed under his breath and pulled harder on Daniel's arm. "That's it. I'm not sticking around to find out what that was." But Daniel's obsession was stronger than fear. He knew this footage could be something extraordinary. His entire career, up until now, had been built on photographs of old, forgotten places. But this was something beyond photographs. This was evidence of a story no one would believe without proof. They pressed deeper into the factory, stepping through long tunnels of brick and steel. The building groaned with age, water dripping steadily from rusted pipes above. In the distance, wind whistled through broken windows, creating tones that almost mimicked a human cry. When they reached the central foundry, both men stopped short. The massive room stretched out like an underground cavern. Giant furnaces loomed on either side, their iron doors hanging open, blackened from decades of use. Catwalks crisscrossed the space high above, rattling faintly in the cold wind. And in the center of the room, rising from the dust and rubble, came a sound unlike anything they had heard before. It wasn't just voices now. It was the rhythmic pounding of machinery, the sharp clang of hammers striking metal, the grinding of gears. For a moment, it was as if they had stepped back in time, into a fully functioning steel plant. Mark's eyes widened. This can't be real. But Daniel barely heard him. His camera was rolling, capturing everything. The sound was so vivid, so layered. He could almost see the workers moving in the shadows. Men in hard hats, sweat on their brows, shouting over the roar of machines. It was a haunting reenactment of the past, but one with no actors. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, pressing against their ears until Daniel thought he might scream just to break it. From the far side of the room, something stirred. A shape moved along the catwalk, slow, deliberate, like a guard pacing its post. The beam of Daniel's flashlight caught only fragments. The outline of a torso, the glint of what looked like a helmet, the swing of arms. And then came the voice again, this time clear, commanding, and very close. "You shouldn't be here." Both men spun, lights darting wildly across the foundry. Nothing. The voice had come from right beside them, but there was no one in sight. Daniel's camera wavered in his hand. "We're recording history," he whispered, half to himself. Mark snapped. "History? This isn't history. It's whatever it is. It doesn't want us here." Before Daniel could answer, a deafening crash erupted from above. Something heavy had fallen onto the catwalk, rattling the entire structure. Dust rained from the ceiling. The men stumbled backward as a section of rusted railing toppled and clanged against the concrete floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot. When the dust cleared, Daniel realized with horror that something else had fallen too. Lying on the floor, half buried in rubble, was a metal lunchbox. It was dented, rusted, but unmistakably real. He picked it up with trembling hands. The faint outline of a name was scratched onto its surface. Thomas R. Keegan, 1971. Daniel stared at it, his breath catching. The name was real. The object was solid. This wasn't just sound and shadows. They were interacting with something tangible. Mark backed away, his face pale. "Daniel, put it down. We're not supposed to touch anything." But before Daniel could respond, the voices surged again. This time not whispers, not chatter, but screams. Agonized, furious screams that filled every inch of the foundry. It was as if the walls themselves were crying out in pain. The two men clamped their hands over their ears, the sound so loud it made their heads throb. Lights flickered from somewhere above, though the factory had no electricity. Shadows danced across the furnaces, stretching into grotesque shapes. And then they heard it, the pounding of footsteps, dozens of them, rushing closer, echoing from every corridor. Mark's panic broke. He grabbed Daniel by the jacket, dragging him toward the exit. "We're leaving now." They sprinted through the foundry, stumbling over debris, the sound of pursuit growing louder behind them. Daniel dared a glance back, and for a split second, he swore he saw them. Figures, dozens of them, workers in torn uniforms, faces smeared with ash and blood, chasing through the darkness with hollow eyes. The men burst through the corridor, their footsteps slamming against the concrete. Every hallway looked the same, twisting and endless. The factory seemed determined to keep them inside, its corridors bending like a maze. Daniel's lungs burned, his legs aching, but adrenaline pushed him forward. The camera swung wildly from his hand, recording only blurred images and the sound of his frantic breath. Finally, they saw it, the faint glow of moonlight spilling through the broken side gate. Salvation! They ran harder, hearts pounding, voices still echoing behind them like a mob in pursuit. As they reached the gate, Daniel risked one last look back. The corridor behind them was empty. No figures, no footsteps, only silence. But just before they stepped outside, the voice returned. Not shouted, not whispered, spoken with calm finality, as though a verdict had been passed. "You'll never forget us." The air outside was freezing, sharp with the scent of the city. They stumbled to the car, gasping, hands shaking as they fumbled for the keys. When the engine roared to life, it was the first real sound that didn't feel like part of the nightmare. Neither of them spoke during the drive back to their hotel. Mark stared out the window, pale and trembling. Daniel gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white, the camera still resting in his lap. But in the silence of the car, he could swear he heard it. A faint whisper, right from the camera, repeating the same word again and again. "Leave, leave, leave." And even though they were miles from the factory, both men knew the voices had followed them. Back in their hotel room in downtown Detroit, the silence felt heavier than anything they had experienced in the factory. Daniel set the camera carefully on the table, as though it were a fragile artifact, while Mark collapsed onto the bed without even taking off his jacket. Neither spoke for several minutes. The only sound was the faint hum of the old heater, struggling against the November cold. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "I'm done, Daniel. That place isn't just abandoned. It's cursed. I'm not stepping foot near it again." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He sat on the edge of his chair, eyes fixed on the camera. Part of him agreed with Mark, but another part, deeper, more stubborn, felt pulled back, as if the factory wasn't finished with them yet. When he finally switched the camera on, his stomach turned. The footage was chaotic, full of shaking frames and blurred images. But the audio was unmistakable. Even in the safe confines of their room, the voices were clear. Whispers, laughter, commands shouted in American accents from decades ago. And then at minute 16, the distinct word, "Leave." Mark sat up when he heard it, his face pale. "Turn it off. Please, just turn it off." Daniel obeyed, though reluctantly. But something chilled him even more than the sound. At the exact moment the word was spoken, the camera had captured a faint shape in the corner of the frame. It wasn't a trick of light. It wasn't dust. It was the blurry outline of a man standing in the locker room. Helmet on his head, eyes blackened like empty sockets. That night neither of them slept. Every time Daniel closed his eyes, he could still hear the whispers, like a chorus murmuring just beyond the edge of hearing. Mark stayed awake, pacing the room, drinking small bottles of whiskey from the minibar, muttering about how they should fly home as soon as possible. The next morning, they boarded their flight back to Manchester. Mark refused to sit near the camera, stuffing his headphones into his ears to block everything out. But Daniel couldn't resist watching the footage again on his laptop. The whispers were there, unexplainable, undeniable. He told himself it was proof, something extraordinary. Yet in the back of his mind, the factory's final words echoed like a curse. "You'll never forget us." When they landed, life tried to return to normal. Mark refused to talk about Detroit at all, burying himself in work and avoiding Daniel's calls. Daniel, however, grew more obsessed. He spent hours each night replaying the footage, slowing it down, isolating the audio. He uploaded snippets to his private files, labeling them with dates and times. The more he listened, the more he noticed something disturbing. The voices weren't limited to the factory recordings anymore. They had started appearing faintly in new videos he filmed back in England. A walk through the streets of Manchester, a trip to a quiet cafe. When he played the files back later, he could hear whispers layered beneath the natural sound. At first he thought it was interference, some kind of technical glitch. But glitches don't form words, and he heard them clear as day. "Keegan, working late. You shouldn't have come." The name chilled him the most. Keegan, the same name scratched into the rusted lunchbox he had touched in the foundry. It was as if the object had tethered something to him. 2 weeks after returning, Daniel woke one night to the sound of footsteps in his flat. Slow, heavy, dragging footsteps moving across the kitchen floor. He leapt from bed, heart pounding, grabbing the nearest thing he could as a weapon, a lamp. But when he stormed into the kitchen, there was nothing, only silence. Except his camera was on the table, and it was recording. He hadn't touched it. He hadn't turned it on. Yet the red light blinked steadily. When he checked the footage later, his blood ran cold. The video showed his empty kitchen, but the audio was filled with the sound of men at work. Hammers, machinery, muffled voices. And then, layered beneath it all, one phrase repeated over and over. "Still here. Still here. Still here." Daniel tried to tell himself it was stress, that his mind was exaggerating things. But deep down, he knew the truth. The factory hadn't stayed in Detroit. It had followed him across the ocean. Mark, meanwhile, had grown distant. When Daniel finally visited him one rainy evening, Mark looked worn down, as though he hadn't slept in days. He admitted that he too had been hearing things at night. The faint echo of machines, the sound of boots marching across his hallway. He had even considered leaving his flat entirely. "It's like they've marked us," Mark said, his voice trembling. "Like we woke something up, and now it won't let us go." Daniel wanted to reassure him. But how could he? He had seen the figures. He had touched the lunchbox. He had heard the voices not only in Detroit, but here in his own home. The haunting escalated in subtle, terrifying ways. Lights flickered without reason. Doors creaked open on their own. Once, as Daniel edited his footage late into the night, his computer screen froze, and in the distortion of the pixels, a face appeared. A man's face, pale, grimy, eyes hollow, staring straight at him. He slammed the laptop shut, his heart in his throat. From that night onward, he began to dream of the factory almost every time he closed his eyes. He would walk through its endless corridors, the voices whispering around him, the figures always one step behind. Sometimes he would wake up drenched in sweat, convinced he had heard the final words again. "You'll never forget us." The strange thing was, part of him didn't want to forget. Part of him felt bound to it, as though the factory had claimed him as one of its own. Weeks passed, and his obsession deepened. He visited libraries, searched archives, tried to uncover the history of the Riverton steel plant. And that was when he discovered something that made his blood run cold. In 1971, the same year scratched into the lunchbox, there had been a catastrophic accident at the plant. A furnace explosion had killed 7 workers and injured dozens more. Their bodies had never been properly recovered from the wreckage. Among the names of the dead, one stood out. Thomas R. Keegan. Daniel shut the book slowly, his hands trembling. He had carried Keegan's lunchbox. He had heard Keegan's name whispered in his recordings. And now, he knew why the voices were so strong. The factory wasn't just echoing. It was crying out for the men who had died inside it. That night, Daniel dreamed again. But this time it wasn't just a dream. He woke in the middle of the night to find himself standing in his hallway, barefoot. The camera clutched in his hand, though he had no memory of picking it up. The red light blinked. The audio played back the same word on repeat. Keegan, Keegan, Keegan. The whispers were no longer confined to Detroit. They were here in Manchester, inside his very home. The winter in Manchester was harsher than usual that year. Rain lashed against the windows of Daniel's flat, the wind carrying a low moan that always made him think of the factory's voices. He had stopped working on anything unrelated to Detroit. His photography assignments went unfinished, his email inbox piled with unanswered messages. His editor called twice before finally giving up. Daniel hardly noticed. Most nights he sat at his desk in the dim glow of his laptop, headphones pressed tightly to his ears as he replayed the factory recordings over and over. He slowed them down, reversed them, filtered them, searching for patterns. And he found them, words hidden beneath layers of static, names called out faintly, commands that seemed directed not at long-gone workers, but at him. The whispers grew more personal with time. "Daniel, don't leave us. You're one of us now." At first he thought it was his imagination twisting meaningless noise into words. But the more he listened, the more certain he became. They knew him. They had remembered him from the night in Detroit. Mark wasn't coping any better. When Daniel visited him again in late December, Mark looked hollow. His flat smelled of stale beer and cigarettes, the curtains drawn tight against the daylight. He had dark circles under his eyes, his hands trembling as he tried to light another cigarette. "You still hear them?" Daniel asked quietly. Mark let out a bitter laugh. "Hear them? They don't stop, mate. I wake up at 3 every bloody morning to the sound of boots walking down my hall. Last night, I swear one of them stood at the foot of my bed. I could feel it watching me. I didn't move until sunrise." Daniel sat beside him. "We need to do something. Research. Maybe there's a way to release them." Mark shook his head violently. "No, I don't want to understand it, Daniel. I just want it gone. Burn the tapes, smash the camera, forget all of it. But forgetting wasn't an option anymore. That very night, after leaving Mark's flat, Daniel walked home through empty streets slick with rain. The sodium lamps glowed orange against the wet pavement, each puddle shimmering with distorted reflections. As he neared his building, he heard it again, voices, faint but undeniable, threading through the hiss of the rain. Still working. Shift's not over. Keegan. He spun around, scanning the street, but it was empty. Not a soul in sight. The whispers weren't outside at all. They were inside his own head. When he reached his flat, he unlocked the door and froze. The camera was sitting on the floor in the hallway. He hadn't left it there. He was sure he had left it on his desk. The red light was blinking, recording. His hands shook as he picked it up. On the tiny screen, the last 3 minutes of footage played automatically. At first it showed only his hallway, dim and silent. Then the image shifted, warped, as though the lens had been breathed on. A face appeared in the blur. A man's face, pale and grimy, with eyes that looked like black pits. Daniel dropped the camera, his stomach lurching. The screen cracked, but the recording continued. From the speaker came a voice, low and guttural. "You'll never leave." The words rattled through his bones. Sleep became impossible after that. Daniel existed in a haze of exhaustion, caffeine, and paranoia. He kept the camera with him at all times, even when he showered or tried to rest on the sofa. The voices no longer confined themselves to the recordings. They followed him into every corner of his life. In the supermarket, he would hear faint shouting between aisles. On the tram, whispers tickled the back of his neck. Once, while photographing an abandoned mill on the outskirts of the city, he swore he saw movement in the upper windows. Men standing shoulder to shoulder, watching him. January dragged in, gray and wet. Daniel's flat grew colder as his heating bills went unpaid. He hardly noticed. He stopped answering phone calls, ignoring friends, ignoring his editor. The only person he spoke to was Mark, and even those conversations were brief and strained. One night, after a week of silence, Mark called in a panic. His voice was raw, trembling. "They're in my flat, Daniel. They're here, right now. I can hear them breathing in the walls. I can't take it anymore." The line went dead before Daniel could respond. He rushed across the city to Mark's building. The stairwell smelled damp, the walls stained with graffiti. When he reached Mark's door, he found it unlocked. The flat inside was dark, the curtains drawn, the air thick with the smell of smoke. "Mark!" Daniel called softly. No answer. He stepped inside, every muscle tense. The living room was empty, bottles scattered across the floor. He moved toward the bedroom, his footsteps sinking into the carpet. The door was half open. Inside, Mark was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. His eyes were wide, his skin pale and clammy. "Mark, it's me," Daniel whispered. Mark turned his head slowly, and for a moment Daniel thought he saw something in his friend's eyes. A flicker of movement, a reflection that didn't belong. Mark opened his mouth, but the words that came out weren't his own. "Still here." Daniel's breath caught. The voice was deeper, layered, as though many people spoke through him at once. Mark's hands trembled violently. Then, with a guttural cry, he collapsed forward, clutching his head. Daniel rushed to his side, but Mark pushed him away, screaming incoherently. His screams weren't just his anymore. They were filled with other voices, dozens of them, echoing through his throat. Daniel staggered back, horror rising in his chest. The factory hadn't just followed them. It was consuming them. That night was the last time Daniel saw Mark alive. 2 days later, the police reported that Mark had thrown himself in front of a train. They called it suicide, but Daniel knew better. Mark hadn't jumped alone. He had been driven. Daniel's obsession turned into desperation. He stopped caring about proof, about footage, about anything except survival. He dug deeper into the history of the Riverton steel plant. He read newspaper archives, interviewed aging residents over the phone, searched through old labor records. The same story emerged again and again. Men worked long hours in brutal conditions. Accidents were common. Deaths were frequent. The 1971 explosion had only been the worst of many tragedies. Those who had died in the plant hadn't died peacefully. They had died screaming, crushed, burned, suffocated. Their voices had never stopped echoing. And now, through some cruel twist of fate, Daniel and Mark had given them a channel, a way out. By the end of February, Daniel was barely recognizable. Thin, sleepless, eyes sunken. His flat was cluttered with papers, photographs, maps of Detroit spread across the walls. The camera sat on his desk like an idol, always recording, always whispering. Sometimes, late at night, when the city outside was silent, he would hear the factory's machinery start up again inside his own flat. The clanging of hammers, the grinding of gears, the hiss of steam. And then, layered beneath it all, the voices chanting his name. One evening, exhausted beyond reason, Daniel whispered back, "What do you want from me?" The answer came immediately, not from the camera, not from the recordings, but from the very air in the room. "You!" The word hung there, heavy, undeniable. Daniel closed his eyes. He realized, with a clarity that chilled him to his core, that leaving Detroit had never truly brought him home. He had carried the factory with him. It lived inside him now, in every breath, in every beat of his heart. And he understood, finally, what the voices had meant that night when they had chased him through the corridors of the plant. "You'll never forget us." It hadn't been a warning. It had been a promise. The dawn crept slowly over the East River, turning the dark silhouette of the Brooklyn Bridge into a golden arch against the morning sky. The city below began to stir again, as if nothing unusual had happened during the long and unsettling hours of the night. But for those who had been there, those who had walked on the bridge at 2 in the morning, and who had seen what should never have been seen, the night had left a shadow that daylight could not erase. James stood near the railing, staring at the water that reflected the rising sun. The familiar noise of cars, the rush of bicycles, the rhythm of footsteps from early commuters. It all felt strangely foreign to him now. His hands were still cold, not from the night air, but from something deeper, a chill that had settled into his bones. Emily approached quietly, holding 2 cups of coffee she had bought from a vendor nearby. She handed one to James, who accepted it without a word. They had barely spoken since the encounter on the bridge. Every time they tried, silence swallowed their voices, as if words were too small to contain what they had experienced. "What do we do now?" Emily finally asked, her voice soft but strained. James shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but I do know one thing. We can't pretend it didn't happen." She looked at him, her eyes tired yet steady. "People won't believe us. Not unless they were there. Behind them, The bridge loomed like an ancient sentinel, its steel and stone holding more than just the weight of cars and trains. It held stories, some forgotten, some whispered, and some that should never be told at all. What they had witnessed was no accident, no trick of the mind. It was part of that hidden history, a truth buried under layers of time and silence. The night replayed itself in their memories. The strange figure that had appeared in the mist, the way the air had grown unnaturally still, the sound, half a scream, half a whisper, that echoed against the cables of the bridge. And then the silence that followed, deeper than any silence they had ever known. James clenched his fists around the paper cup. It felt like the bridge wanted us to see it, like it chose us. Emily shivered, not from the cold, but from the thought. Or maybe it was a warning. They both turned to look back at the span of the bridge, stretching across the river as thousands of people went about their ordinary lives upon it, unaware of the night's secret. Life moved forward, but James and Emily knew they had been changed. The city was no longer just a city. The bridge was no longer just a bridge. The sun rose higher, bathing the world in light. Yet the memory of the darkness lingered. They finished their coffee in silence, knowing that whatever they decided, to speak, to write, or to remain silent, the story of what happened on the Brooklyn Bridge at 2 in the morning would live inside them forever. And perhaps that was how it was meant to be. Not as a tale to be shared at dinner tables, not as an article to be printed in newspapers, but as a quiet burden, a reminder that even in the most familiar places, the unknown waits patiently for those who dare to cross its path. With one last glance at the bridge, James and Emily walked away, blending back into the city. But neither of them looked back. They didn't need to. The bridge would always be there, holding its secret, waiting for the next soul to pass through its shadow at the wrong hour of the night.